In the dust-choked town of Dry Creek, where prejudice ran deeper than any river and tradition held tighter than barbed wire, one woman did something unthinkable. She followed her heart. Her name was Clara Monroe, the daughter of a Union veteran and the local schoolmistress. Refined, respected, raised with all the expectations of a proper frontier woman. But the day she was seen walking hand in hand with an Apache man, under the open sky, with no shame and no explanation, was the day the town turned its back on her. Doors closed, whispers sharpened, and Clara became something worse than forgotten. She became condemned. But this isn't a story about shame. It's a story about courage. About a woman who chose love over fear, who stood in a church built by her ancestors and declared her soul belonged not to a flag or a town or a bloodline, but to a man the world told her to hate. His name was Taza, a warrior, yes, but also a healer, a poet, a man who had seen his people hunted like wolves and still chose to walk gently through the world. Their love wasn't loud. It was patient, sacred, the kind that bloomed in silence, like wildflowers after rain. What happened next wasn't written in any Bible or law book. The townsfolk branded her a traitor. They called her unclean, ungodly, unworthy. She lost her job, her friends, her safety. But she never lost her resolve. And when they told her to leave, when they demanded she walk alone through the valley and never return, she did so with her chin high, her hand in Taza's, and her heart full. That should have been the end of her story. But then, the warriors came. No one expected it. Not the preacher, not the mayor, not even Clara. As she stepped into the dry canyon outside town, ready to begin a life with no home, no kin, and no promise of safety, she found a path laid before her, lined with feathers, sage, and blossoms. Apache warriors stood silent on either side, not with weapons, but with reverence. They hadn't come to fight. They'd come to honor a woman who had honored them. And in that moment, the West itself seemed to hold its breath. Because something had changed. Something sacred had been restored. And this is the story of how it happened. Clara Monroe's story didn't begin in rebellion. It began in rhythm. The quiet rhythm of a woman who woke before the sun, taught children with a tender hand, and wrote poems by lantern light. For 22 years, she lived by the rules of Dry Creek. Speak when spoken to, smile without question, and never look too long at those the town deemed outside. But Clara always had a curious heart, and it was during one of her morning walks near the canyon trail that she first saw Taza, not as a shadow or threat, but as a man gathering wild herbs with a reverence that humbled her. Their eyes met across a stream, and neither spoke. But something passed between them that no law or church could explain. In the days that followed, Clara returned to the trail, not out of defiance, but out of a longing she couldn't name. Taza was there again, and again. At first, they exchanged nods, then words, then truths. She learned of his mother's death during a cavalry raid, of his people's stolen land, of the names he no longer spoke aloud. He listened to her stories, too, about the cold silence at her dinner table, about a town that worshipped tradition but forgot kindness. Together, they built something delicate, not romance in the way songs describe it, but trust. And in a land built on fences and firepower, trust was the rarest kind of love. But love is never invisible for long in places that fear it. One afternoon, a ranch hand spotted Clara placing a necklace of wildflowers around Taza's neck. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. By sundown, the story had spread like dry brush fire. Clara Monroe consorting with a savage, they said, tarnishing her family's name. Overnight, she became a stranger in her own town. The children were pulled from her classroom. Her neighbors crossed the street when she passed. Her mother wept. Her father drank. The silence of Dry Creek was no longer peaceful. It was judgment sharpened to a blade. Still, Clara did not recant. She met Taza each day at the canyon trail, where the wind carried no gossip and the cliffs held no eyes. There, they spoke of building a home away from both worlds, a cabin near the Red River, where his tribe once fished before the waters were fenced off. They dreamed of a place where no one asked permission to love. But the town had other plans. One morning, the mayor, flanked by the preacher and 3 councilmen, came to Clara's door. "Leave," they said. "Leave by sundown, or we'll make sure no one in this territory offers you shelter. Clara didn't cry. She didn't beg. She packed one small bag, placed her hand in Taza's, and turned toward the canyon. She left behind her books, her letters, her childhood bed. But she carried with her the one thing they could never take, her dignity. She believed that was the end of her chapter in Dry Creek. But what waited in the canyon was something no soul could have predicted. The canyon that once cradled Clara's secret meetings now stood before her as a corridor of exile. She and Taza walked side by side, their steps quiet on the earth, their hands linked not out of comfort but conviction. Behind them, Dry Creek simmered with whispers. Ahead of them, silence. Clara's heart pounded not with fear, but with the ache of everything she'd left behind. Yet Taza walked with stillness in his eyes. He had known exile long before her. He understood what it meant to be cast out by those too afraid to see beauty in difference. But as they rounded the bend beneath the great stone arch, something shifted in the air. The wind, once sharp, turned warm. A scent followed, sage, wild mint, and something floral. Clara slowed. The ground ahead shimmered not with heat, but with color. Petals. Dozens. Then hundreds. A trail of flowers laid across the canyon floor, stretching toward the riverbed like a ribbon of devotion. Clara gasped. Taza's hand tightened around hers. And then they saw them. Standing on both sides of the flower path were warriors. Apache men in full ceremonial dress. Some elders, some barely more than boys. Faces painted with reverence. Not anger. Not one held a weapon. They held bundles of herbs, rattles, feathers, and offerings. As Clara stepped forward, they bowed. Not deeply, but enough to let the canyon feel it. No one spoke. The gesture was louder than words. She was not a traitor here. She was honored. Clara wept. Not from sorrow, but from a release so powerful her knees nearly buckled. This wasn't just forgiveness. It was acceptance. Celebration. These men, whose lives had been shaped by violence and betrayal, had gathered not to resist, but to welcome. Not to punish, but to bless. The petals beneath her feet were symbols of every woman who had never been allowed to choose. And now, through her, they walked again. Taza led her down the path, his voice low in her ear. "You are not alone anymore," he whispered. "Not here. Not ever." And as the final warriors stepped aside, revealing the mouth of the trail leading into open land, Clara understood something she would carry forever. The West was not a place of hate. It was a place waiting to be healed, one act of love at a time. The trail of flowers faded behind them, but its memory burned brighter than any torch. As Clara and Taza walked deeper into the open plains, the sky stretched wider, and the air tasted freer. They didn't speak for a long time. There were no words fit to capture what had just happened. Clara kept glancing back, half expecting it all to vanish like a mirage. But it hadn't. The warriors had come. The path had been real, and it had told her one thing she'd never heard in her life. You are worthy, just as you are. They made their way toward the land near the Red River, where the soil ran richer and the cottonwoods whispered ancient songs. Taza knew this place from his childhood, before the land had been claimed by railroad men and ranchers with papers. There, he found a small rise near a bend in the river, shaded by trees, far from the reach of fences or judgment. "Here," he said, pointing. "This is where our home begins." And Clara, who had once dreamed of lace curtains and church bells, now saw beauty in fire pits, in wind-worn stone, and the call of hawks overhead. They built the cabin together, log by log, with sweat and stories and hands that learned each other's strength. It wasn't perfect. Storms came. The roof leaked. Food ran thin some weeks. But every night, when the fire cracked and the stars filled the black above, Clara felt something she had never known in Dry Creek. Peace. No masks. No guilt. Just truth, raw and tender, shared between two people who had nothing left to hide. Occasionally, travelers passed through, trappers, drifters, even a soldier once. Most avoided eye contact. A few muttered slurs under their breath. But there were some who paused, who noticed the garden Clara had grown from seeds gifted by the Apache women, who heard the way Taza sang to the river at night, who felt the stillness of that place, not as emptiness, but as invitation. Some of them stayed for a meal, a story, a lesson, and they left changed. Over time, word began to spread, not of rebellion, but of a place where the old wounds of the West were being tended, where love wasn't whispered in shadows, but spoken aloud, where a woman who had once been called a traitor now stood tall, a bridge between two broken worlds. And though Clara never sought attention, her story began to echo, carried by wind, by hoof, by heart. Back in Dry Creek, the name Clara Monroe became something of a ghost, spoken rarely, and only in quiet corners. Some said she'd died out in the canyon, punished by the spirits for her betrayal. Others claimed she'd run off east and married a banker. But a few, just a few, had seen the truth. Ranchers who rode farther than they were used to. Traders who returned from the northern routes with tales of a woman with sky-colored eyes and soil under her fingernails, who spoke Apache as fluently as English and wore her hair braided with feathers and thread. The mayor never mentioned her again. The preacher rewrote his sermons to focus on obedience. And the schoolhouse now had a new teacher, one who never walked the canyon trails alone. But there were moments, rare and unexpected, when Clara's name stirred something in the townsfolk. When a child asked why the wind sounded different near the canyon. When a traveling merchant passed through and said, "You from the place where the woman walked the flower path?" And the silence that followed said more than any answer could. Years passed, and the world began to change, slowly, unevenly. Telegraph lines crept across the plains. Towns grew fat on trade and timber. But out near the Red River, Clara and Taza remained untouched by the rush. They built a life that pulsed with quiet reverence for the land, for their love, and for the story they refused to let history erase. Taza taught children from nearby tribes how to read and write. Clara wrote their stories in journals that would one day fill shelves. Together, they turned pain into seed and grew something whole from what had once been broken. Then came the spring when the canyon bloomed wild again. No path, no warriors, no ceremony. Just nature, speaking in color. Clara walked those trails alone now, older, slower, but just as strong. She left feathers where the petals had once been, not as payment, but as gratitude. The land had given her something the town never could, a truth deeper than law, a belonging more powerful than blood. And it said that when the wind moves just right through that canyon, if you close your eyes, you can still hear the rustle of dresses, the soft patter of petals, and the hush of warriors bowing in unison, honoring not just a love, but a woman brave enough to walk where no one else dared. One summer evening, long after the rains had kissed the soil into bloom, a young rider arrived at Clara's homestead. He was barely more than a boy, cheeks sunburned, boots worn thin, carrying nothing but a knapsack and a tattered journal. Clara, now with silver streaking through her hair, welcomed him with a bowl of soup and a quiet smile. As they sat beneath the cottonwoods, the boy opened the journal. "My grandmother was from Dry Creek," he said, voice trembling. "She told me about you, but they always called you a ghost. I had to see if you were real." Clara didn't answer right away. She simply nodded toward the small garden where sunflowers leaned lazily in the golden light. "I'm no ghost," she said softly. "I just chose not to haunt the wrong house." The boy smiled at that, tired, grateful. He had questions, many of them, but she didn't give answers quickly. She gave stories. Stories of the trail lined with petals. Of the night the warriors sang beneath a moon too big for silence. Of Taza's laughter, still echoing across the river when the frogs began to sing. The boy stayed for 3 days. He helped gather herbs, learned how to weave a reed basket, listened to Clara read aloud from the journals she had written over the decades. On the 4th morning, before the sun rose, he prepared to leave. Clara gave him 2 things, a small stone marked with the Apache sun symbol, and a warning wrapped in love. The world will still tell you who you're allowed to love, what you're allowed to believe. Don't let it. The land is wiser than the laws of men. As he rode away, Clara watched the dust rise behind him and thought of her own ride into the canyon so many years ago. Back then, she had carried shame, fear, and defiance in equal measure. Now, she carried legacy. What had begun as exile had become sanctuary. Her love was no longer a scandal. It was a story, one that would be carried by riders, passed between campfires, whispered to children too young to understand its weight, but old enough to feel its truth. And somewhere beyond the horizon, that boy would one day tell another, who would tell another, until the name Clara Monroe was no longer buried in silence, but lifted by generations who saw in her not a traitor, but a pioneer of the heart, a woman who loved freely and taught the West a lesson it had long forgotten, that the most dangerous kind of strength is the one that loves boldly, even when the world demands silence. As the seasons folded over each other like pages in a well-worn book, the homestead changed too. New trees rose from old stumps. The garden grew wilder, and Clara, though slower in step, still moved with the same quiet purpose. She spent her mornings writing, her afternoons tending, and her evenings sitting by the fire, waiting for the stories to come to her. Some came in dreams, others in the rustling of leaves, but all of them were stitched together by one unshakable truth: love, when lived without apology, outlasts all else. Every so often, old faces reappeared, some from neighboring tribes, others from distant towns. One day, a woman arrived in a faded bonnet and trembling hands. She had been Clara's student once, long before the exile. "They said you died," she whispered. Clara only smiled. "I did," she replied, "but not in the way they meant." They sat together for hours, two women shaped by different roads, yet bound by the memory of a classroom where compassion had once bloomed, quietly, under the nose of intolerance. Taza, though gone now from the flesh, was never far. His carvings still lined the porch. His flute rested beneath the window, and when the moon rose, Clara would often walk to the river and speak aloud as if he stood beside her, asking him what the coyotes were saying, laughing at old memories only the two of them knew. The land, ever faithful, responded with wind, with warmth, with peace. His presence, like their love, was rooted in soil and sky alike. As the world outside modernized, railroads turned to highways, telegrams to radios, Clara's home remained untouched by the urgency of progress. People began calling it the Flower Trail Cabin, and slowly, it became a place of pilgrimage, not for fame or spectacle, but for seekers, for the ones who felt different, who loved in ways the world didn't yet understand. They came, hoping to see the path lined with petals. But what they found was something more lasting, the echo of courage, written into the stones. And though Clara never charged a coin, never asked for anything in return, each visitor left something behind: a feather, a poem, a ring, a promise. Over time, the house became a mosaic of quiet rebellion and sacred tenderness, and the West, once hardened by steel and silence, softened. One story, one petal, one brave woman at a time. As Clara entered her later years, the lines on her face deepened not from sorrow, but from sun, wind, and decades of smiling in the face of everything meant to silence her. Her hands, once delicate, had become strong with age, etched with stories from gardening, woodwork, and years of writing her truth by candlelight. And though time had slowed her body, it sharpened her spirit. She had outlived those who once condemned her. She had seen the world shift, inch by inch, towards something that resembled grace. One spring morning, Clara woke to find a young couple waiting quietly outside her gate, a woman with braids like rivers and a man with fair skin and nervous eyes. They didn't ask to come in. They just stood there, hands clasped, until Clara beckoned them forward. Over tea, they explained they were to be married, but neither family approved. "We wanted to come here," the woman said, voice trembling, "where someone once walked through fire and left flowers behind." Clara didn't offer advice. She offered stories. She told them how love had nearly broken her, but had also rebuilt her. How the world will always fear what it doesn't understand, but fear cannot touch a love that is rooted deep, like mesquite in dry ground. She told them they didn't need to prove anything. Not to the world, not even each other. They only needed to stand. And by the time the couple left, their eyes carried something different. Not just hope, but inheritance. That same evening, Clara walked the edge of the canyon one last time. She traced the old flower path in her memory, feeling where the petals had once been, where the warriors had once stood. She didn't cry. She smiled, because what had started as exile had become sanctuary, and then something greater, legacy, a truth that had refused to die, even when buried beneath shame and dust, a truth that still breathed in the footsteps of the brave. And though she didn't know the hour or the day, Clara knew her time was nearing, not with dread, but with peace, because she had done what the West rarely allowed. She had lived on her own terms, loved without permission, and planted beauty where others had left only scars. And long after she was gone, the canyon would remember. The earth would whisper her name, and flowers would bloom in places no one expected. Clara passed quietly one summer night, wrapped in a quilt stitched from old dresses and old stories. No one found her for 3 days, until a young girl from the nearby settlement came to bring fresh vegetables. She didn't scream or run. She simply knelt, placed her small hand over Clara's, and whispered, "Thank you." Word spread quickly, and before long, people from every corner of the territory began arriving, not in mourning, but in reverence. They didn't bring black veils or sermons. They brought feathers, seeds, handwritten letters, and petals. So many petals that the canyon floor glowed with color. The trail of flowers was reborn, not by warriors this time, but by dreamers, lovers, and children who'd grown up on stories of Clara Monroe. They walked it in silence, step by step, until they reached her cabin. There, beneath the cottonwoods, they laid her to rest, beside Taza, whose grave had waited patiently all those years. No preacher led the service. No hymn was sung. Only the sound of wind, the cry of a hawk overhead, and the voices of many languages whispering thanks. In place of a tombstone, a circle of smooth stones was arranged around a single stalk of wild sunflower. At the center, a carved wooden plaque read, "She walked where love was forbidden and taught the land to bloom again." Generations passed, and the cabin weathered storms, droughts, and time. But it never fell. Travelers still came, some seeking answers, others just needing to know such a woman had truly lived. The journals she wrote were copied, passed from hand to hand, studied in universities, whispered beside fire pits, etched into memory. And though many forgot the names of the men who had once tried to silence her, none forgot Clara. Because Clara had not resisted the world's hatred, she had replaced it. And somewhere in the West, where the wind still sings through sage and stone, the canyon still remembers. The path of petals still grows wild each spring. And when young hearts feel afraid to love freely, to live honestly, they follow that trail, not just with feet, but with faith. The same faith Clara had when she chose not fear, but love. Not silence, but truth. Not a safe road, but a sacred one. And that made all the difference. Years turned to decades, and the story of Clara Monroe became more than memory. It became legend. Not the kind embroidered by exaggeration, but the kind built from truth too powerful to fade. Historians debated details. Skeptics tried to pare it down to folklore. But those who had walked the flower path, who had stood in the canyon's hush, knew better. You could feel her there, in the rustling of leaves, in the soft hush of feathers falling, in the hush that followed brave footsteps through forbidden ground. The land itself had become her witness. Trees bent toward her garden as if in quiet prayer. Rain came when it was needed most. Travelers who camped beneath her porch spoke of strange dreams, visions of a woman in a long blue dress, walking beside a man with eyes like firelight, both moving without fear through a world that had once cursed them. And always, always in the dream, flowers bloomed at their feet, bright against the dust. Children grew up hearing her story not as tragedy, but as courage. Teachers whispered it before bedtime. Mothers sang it in lullabies. And when young girls came of age, those who felt different, who loved differently, who feared being cast out, they would sit under open skies and say, "If Clara did it, I can too." That name, once spit with venom, now bloomed with reverence. Clara wasn't just a woman anymore. She was a path. And as the world modernized, paved over valleys and stretched wires across open fields, the cabin remained untouched, respected. When surveyors came to build near the canyon, they stopped. One of them, they said, felt a chill so sharp it froze his boots in place. Another, when asked to bulldoze a nearby cottonwood, dropped his axe and quit on the spot. Some places, he muttered, don't want to be disturbed. And so the canyon stood. The trail stood. The story stood, not guarded by guns or chains, but by the reverence of those who had felt its truth. And long after Clara's voice fell silent, her message rang louder than ever. That love, when walked with courage, changes not just people, but land, blood, memory, and time itself. It is said that once a year, when spring breaks through winter's last breath, a soft wind moves through the canyon like a whisper. No one knows the exact day. It just happens. And on that day, without fail, petals appear. Dozens of them. Reds, yellows, whites. Some say they fall from birds. Others claim they grow overnight from the earth itself. But everyone who sees it knows. The flower path is walking again. Couples come from distant lands to follow it. Some walk hand in hand. Others in silence. A few bring tears. All bring something buried. Something the world told them to hide. And as they reach the spot where Clara once stood tall against shame and fear, something unspoken happens. Not a miracle, not magic, just a remembering, a returning, a truth rising from the soil like a bloom after fire. There are no plaques large enough, no books complete enough, to contain what she left behind. Because Clara Monroe did not just change her town. She healed something ancient in the land itself. She reminded it that love, when carried with honor, can outlast guns, gossip, and time. That truth, once walked, never dies. It roots. It grows. It calls others to walk beside it. And so the story lives on, not bound by pages, but carried in footsteps. In every soul who dares to love without apology. In every heart that chooses tenderness over fear. In every path that begins with exile and ends in flowers. Clara walked alone once, but no one walks alone anymore. The trail is still open. The wind still sings. And somewhere, always, petals are waiting. Clara Monroe's story is not just a tale from the past. It is a mirror, a reminder that in every era, there are those who dare to walk against the current, not out of rebellion, but out of conviction. Her journey began with love, but it was never only about romance. It was about dignity, about standing when the world demands silence, about choosing truth even when it costs you everything familiar. And in the face of exile, she did not crumble, she bloomed. Because when the ground beneath you rejects your footsteps, you plant your own trail, one that others may one day follow. What Clara and Taza built was not just a cabin, or a garden, or a quiet life. It was a legacy, a living, breathing message written not in ink, but in wildflowers and wind, in the quiet echo of a canyon that now carries her name without ever needing to speak it. And perhaps what makes their story endure is not its drama, but its honesty, its deep, unwavering insistence that love is sacred, no matter how the world tries to define it. We live in a time where division still echoes loudly, where judgment still travels faster than understanding. But Clara's story reminds us that peace is not found in waiting for the world to accept you. Peace is forged by choosing your truth and walking it boldly, even if the trail has never been walked before. And sometimes, when one soul dares to do that, the land itself rises to meet them with flowers underfoot. If this story stirred something in your chest, if it made you pause, reflect, or simply breathe a little deeper, then don't let it fade with the scroll of a screen. Let it live on in you, in how you speak, in how you love, in how you stand for others who walk quietly but bravely through their own canyons. The flower path still exists, not just in the West, but in every heart brave enough to carry it forward. And if you believe stories like this still matter, stories of courage, grace, and love that outlives hate, then join us here. Subscribe for more tales that remind us who we are and who we still can be. Leave your thoughts in the comments, your story, your voice. Like the video if it meant something to you. Because every time you share your truth, the trail grows longer and the petals grow brighter.